Ottawa, on, the Honourable Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and the official opposition, released the following statement to announce the new inflation-busting Conservative shadow cabinet. I am proud to announce a hard-working and strong team that will take on Trudeau and his costly coalition and their plans to continue to cripple the Canadian economy and make life more costly for Canadians. Together with this team, Conservatives will take on just inflation, fight all of Trudeau and his costly coalition's tax hikes, including his plans to triple the expensive carbon tax, and tackle the cost of living crisis so that young people can buy a home, families can afford nutritious food, and our seniors can retire with dignity. Together, we will ensure Canadians benefit from the fruits of their labor, so they can take back control of their lives here in Canada, the freest country on earth. Conservative Shadow Cabinet. Shadow Minister for Digital Government, Ben Lobb. Shadow Minister for Agriculture, Agri-Food and Food Security, John Barlow. Shadow Minister for Canadian Heritage, Rachel Thomas. Shadow Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations, Jagmeet Singh. Shadow Minister for Finance and Middle Class Prosperity, Chrystia Freeland. Shadow Minister for Employment, Future Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, Tracy Gray. Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change, Gerard Deltel. Shadow Minister for Families, Children and Social Development, Michelle Freire. Shadow Minister for Federal Economic Development Agency for Eastern, Central and Southern Ontario, Leanne Rood. Shadow Minister for Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard, Clifford Small. Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Honourable Michael Chong. Shadow Minister for Health, Dr. Stephen Ellis. Shadow Minister for Housing and Diversity and Inclusion, Scott Aitchison. Shadow Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, Tom Kamik. Shadow Minister for Federal Economic Development Agency for Northern Ontario, Eric Melillo. Shadow Minister for Innovation, Science and Industry, Rick Perkins. Shadow Minister for International Development, Garnet Genuis. Shadow Minister for International Trade, Kyle Seaback. Shadow Minister for Small Business Recovery and Growth, Brad Viss. Shadow Minister for Supply Chain Issues, Matt Generu. Shadow Minister for Red Tape Reduction, Scott Davidson. Shadow Minister for Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Honourable Rob Moore. Shadow Minister for Civil Liberties, Marilyn Gladu. Shadow Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, Todd Doherty. Shadow Minister for Addictions, Layla Goodridge. Shadow Minister for Northern Affairs and Arctic Sovereignty, Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency, Bob Zimmer. Shadow Minister for Prairie Economic Development, Advisor to the Leader, Economy, Pat Kelly. Shadow Minister for Pacific Economic Development, Daco Van Popter. Shadow Minister for Sport, Economic Development Agency of Canada for the Regions of Quebec, Richard Martel. Shadow Minister for National Revenue, Adam Chambers. Shadow Minister for Natural Resources, Shannon Stubbs. Shadow Minister for Official Languages, Joel Godin. Shadow Minister for Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, Jake Stewart. Shadow Minister for Public Safety, Raquel Doncho. Shadow Minister for Public Services and Procurement, Kelly Block. Shadow Minister for Emergency Preparedness, Dane Lloyd. Shadow Minister for Rural Economic Development and Connectivity, Dan Mazier. Shadow Minister for Seniors, Anna Roberts. Shadow Minister for Tourism, Tony Baldinelli. Shadow Minister for Transport, Mark Strull. Shadow Minister for Treasury Board, Stephanie Cusey. Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs, Blake Richards. Shadow Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth, Karen Vecchio. Shadow Minister for Ethics and Accountable Government, Michael Barrett. Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Communities, Dr. Leslyn Lewis. Shadow Minister for Labour, Chris Lewis. Shadow Minister for Indigenous Services, Gary Vidal. Shadow Minister for Pan-Canadian Trade and Competition, Ryan Williams. Shadow Minister for Hunting, Fishing and Conservation, Blaine Calkins. Shadow Minister for Democratic Reform, Michael Cooper. Associate Shadow Minister for Finance and Middle Class Prosperity, Tax Reform, Phil Lawrence. Associate Shadow Minister for Finance and Middle Class Prosperity, Affordable Government, Marty Morantz. Associate Shadow Minister for Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard, Recreational and West Coast, Mel Arnold. Associate Shadow Minister for National Defence, Recruitment and Retention, Shelby Cramp-Newman. Associate Shadow Minister for Natural Resources, Nuclear, Corey Tocher. Associate Shadow Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth, Dominique Vian. Associate Shadow Minister for Agriculture, Richard Lehoux. Associate Shadow Minister for Agriculture, Warren Steinley. Associate Shadow Minister for Canadian Heritage, Kevin Waugh. Associate Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change, Robert Kitchen. Associate Shadow Minister for Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship, Brad Radikop. Associate Shadow Minister for Indigenous Services, Larry Brock. Associate Shadow Minister for Labour, Rosemary Falk. Associate Shadow Minister for Ethics and Accountable Government, Jacques Gord. Associate Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs, Fraser Tolmie. Associate Shadow Minister for Transport, Dan Mize. Associate Shadow Minister for Public Safety, Doug Shipley. Associate Shadow Minister for Official Languages, Bernard Enaru. Associate Shadow Minister for International Trade, Advisor to the Leader, Canada/US Relations, Randy Hoback. Associate Shadow Minister for Justice and Attorney General, Frank Caputo.